The City of Toronto, including all 100 branches of Toronto Public Library, are situated on Indigenous land and Dish with One Spoon territory. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Toronto Public Library gratefully acknowledges these Indigenous nations for their guardianship of this land and acknowledge that these lands continue to be home to many diverse First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. I encourage all of us to take a moment in our everyday life to meditate on our relationship to this land and to each other. Now, we do have a bit of time to address some of your questions today, but please make sure to enter your questions into the Ask a Question box that's right here on the bottom of your screen. And to stay on top of all of TPL's cultural events, you can click on follow, which I believe is just right up here on the top of your screen. And if you like, you can get notifications every time we add a new event or as an event is about to go live. Some upcoming events that might be of interest to you include Alan Doyle. Yes, that Alan Doyle, one of the East Coast's favorite sons, shares a bit of Newfoundland with his new book, All Together Now. Catch him live on December 9th. And don't forget, we're hosting the award ceremony for the Toronto Book Awards on November 30th. The shortlist was just announced this week, and we're super excited about this event. Now, our host tonight is Dimitri Nasrallah. Dimitri is the award-winning author of 3 novels, most recently, The Bleeds. His first novel, Black Body, won Quebec's McGill First Book Prize and was a finalist for the Grand Prix du Livre de Montreal. His second novel, Nico, won the Hugh MacLennan Prize for Fiction and was nominated for CBC's Canada Reads and the International Dublin Literary Award. Michael Posner is a journalist whose work has been seen in the Globe and Mail, the Financial Times, and Toronto Life. However, he is perhaps best known for his work as biographer to Canadian icons such as Mordecai Richler, Anne Murray, and now, of course, Leonard Cohen. If you haven't already picked up this wonderful exploration of one of Canada's most prolific artists, the first in a planned trilogy, you can click the button right here at the bottom that says, click here to buy Leonard Cohen, The Untold Stories. This will take you directly to one of our favorite independent bookstores, Queen Books. Please support your local, independently run bookstores whenever possible. Now, without further ado, please welcome our host, Dimitri Nasrallah, and Mr. Michael Posner. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Hello, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. It's a real treat.
Oh, congratulations on the book as well. The first of a trilogy, as we hear. Now, I'm fascinated by music biographies in general, and especially the oral history form, because you really feel that you're getting almost fragments from every perspective, and you get disagreements along the way, and the conflicts really bring the work to life. You see a three-dimensionality to the character, and Cohen is a character that's full of conflict and ambition, and I hope to get into all of that today. But you state early on in the book that you first approached Cohen about this project in 2007. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know the exact date, but it was in that vicinity. It was just in the period after which he had discovered that his former personal manager had absconded, it's alleged, with $5 million of his money, and he was in the middle of litigation. And so he wrote me back a very kind note and said, it's an interesting idea, but I'm not in any position to participate in such a venture at this time. And so I kind of let it go. I thought it was a very gracious no thank you. And then I dropped it. And he, as you know, subsequently went back on the road. Very successful concert tour that spanned the better part of 5 years, from 2008 to 2013. I was busy at the Globe and Mail at the time, and I kind of just dropped the idea until he passed. It'll be 4 years ago later this week, the 8th of November. And then I resurrected the idea. I thought, he's not with us, but maybe there's still something I can do with this.
Now, over the past couple of years, we've had a few books come out about Leonard Cohen, most notably 2013's I'm Your Man by Sylvie Simmons. In 2017, we had So Long, Marianne come out by Carrie Hesta Hamar. This book is different, though. You've taken a different approach, and I imagine you were quite conscious about not replicating what had come before. Can you take us through the thought process of approaching this as an oral history and what you hope to gain from that?
Well, I'd always been partial to oral history. I'd done the same thing with a little book on Mordecai Richler, 2004, 2005, somewhere around there. I liked it precisely for the reasons that you cite, which is that you get more points of view are brought to the table than you would get perhaps in a conventional biography. It gives you more dimensions, more angles, more perspectives on a single individual. It doesn't, I didn't know Cohen. I mean, I guess I could take um, the same material, the same facts, and try to impose an authorial point of view on him, as Sylvie Simmons did. And hers, by the way, is a terrific book. I don't want to denigrate it for a moment, but I thought it was necessary to try something a little different. And I was and have been partial to oral biography from the get-go. So that was my thinking. At the same time, if you're going to pretend to be a biography, you still have to cover the same ground that the others have covered. So the challenge really was to look at some of those familiar storylines and try, if possible, to bring to bear some new angle, some new perspective on the same story.
And I would say at about 500 plus interviews that you ended up conducting for this book, you certainly have uncovered new ground. Now, this is going to be the first of 3 volumes. This volume covers specifically from his birth, actually predating that. We can say arguably it begins in the mid-19th century, if we're going to talk about when the Cohens first show up in Montreal, to 1970, his first international tour. Can we get something of the goalpost of what the next 2 volumes of the trilogy will cover?
Well, this is somewhat tentative because it'll depend how long the books are and how much material I have. But in general, I think we're trying to aim for starting in 1971 and going till about 1988, just after the release of the I'm Your Man album and its success. So maybe 1988, 1989, maybe ending there. And then the 3rd volume, which would appear in 2022, autumn 2022, would cover the years through the 1990s into the 2000s, the final years of the tour, his illness and death, etc.
Now, with 500 interviews, where do you start? What was the first email you sent out?
The first guy I called, the first guy who consented to an interview, I think I made one call before that where I did not get consent. But the first guy who consented was David Solway, who's a wonderful Canadian poet and was a friend of Leonard's. Not a close friend, but certainly an acquaintance and to some extent a disciple of Leonard's. And he had some wonderful stories, and then he had some suggestions. Inevitably in this process, one interview leads to 2 others. And so it kind of multiplies in that way. And sometimes people would give you a name and you don't know where they are or if they are. Are they still with us? So you have to find them, you have to track them down, you have to persuade them to participate. So I began with David, who was great, and that led me to some extent into the poetry community of Montreal in the 50s and 60s.
And where we end up beginning with all this is this borough of Westmount, which is very familiar and has a status to people who live in Montreal, but less so to people who are not from the city. Perhaps we can begin there, because it seems that Westmount, the borough, is part and parcel with Cohen, the person, and the subsequent artist. How did it shape who he became?
Oh, in profound and fundamental ways, unquestionably. I mean, at the time that he's there, I guess Jews are probably still a minority in Westmount, but they are a growing minority. They're, by definition, if you're in Westmount, you are to some extent materially comfortable, if not affluent. His family was particularly comfortable, particularly affluent. His grandfather was a major mover and shaker in the Montreal Jewish community, belonged to every important Jewish institution, sat on the boards of all these institutions. His great uncle had been the chief rabbi of Montreal. He's very active in the synagogue as a young man. He goes to Jewish summer camps. His Jewish identity is stamped on him at a very early age and never really leaves him, despite all his wanderings in the world of Scientology, the world of Zen, even his interest in Christianity in an intellectual sense. So Judaism is fundamentally part of that, and it's a very small community ultimately in Montreal, the Jewish community. They are a minority within a minority, as it were, and so I think that also begins to shape his vision and perspective on the world. You are never really part of the in crowd. You're not part of the in Anglo crowd, and you're not part of the obviously Francophone majority. So it has an enormous effect. And his best friends came from his childhood ultimately.
It's true what you say. It really comes out in the book, what you're saying about the Jewish community. They're very tightly knit, and the Cohens were very central to that community. They were a pillar of that community. You get the sense while reading this that unlike other people who have passed through religious families, Cohen never really saw religion as being separate from him. He doesn't question it at all. It's 100% accepted in who he is, and that ends up informing everything else he does.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, he was frequently asked about this because he dives into Zen roughly 1971, 72. He ultimately dives even deeper into it in the 1990s and goes to sit in his robes on a mountaintop east of Los Angeles for the better part of 5 years. And he becomes an ordained Zen Buddhist monk in the Rinzai-ji tradition, one of the most difficult disciplines that there is in Zen. And yet in every interview, he would say, no, I'm a Jew. I have a perfectly good religion. There's nothing wrong with my religion. I've never turned my back on it. And all through this period, he's still reading Kabbalah. He's still immersing himself in books about Judaism. He's still engaging with rabbis hither and yon. So his Judaism was fundamental to him. He never left it.
So we have this pillar of Judaism coming from his father's side, and also this almost aristocratic sense of industry that comes with the Cohens and all they do in Montreal. But his mother is quite a different person. Masha almost seems to be the bristling creative intellect that he ends up inheriting. Can you tell us a little bit more about her?
Yeah, she's a really fascinating character. I mean, it's a shame there weren't more people around to talk about her, but even in the limited number that I was able to find who knew her, she emerges as this earthy and beautiful and almost sexy individual, but with a great interest in music and the arts, learned in ways that you might not have expected from an immigrant to Canada. She's she sits at a bit of a distance from the rest of the Cohen family because she speaks with a Russian accent, because she's an immigrant, because she wasn't raised in that almost Edwardian culture in Westmount. But she on the one hand is very encouraging of Leonard. She fosters his art lessons when he's a young man, his music lessons. She encourages him in his writing, and yet at the same time, she has moments when she is very much the Jewish mother and is tearing her hair out, thinking what is going to become of this boy who, how can he make a living as a writer? That's simply not possible in Canada of the 1950s or early 1960s. So she's a really engaging woman, and their relationship is complicated, like many of Leonard's relationship, but particularly so because his father passes away when he's 9 years old, and although he has an older sister, Leonard is the only young man in the house, and he almost effectively becomes the man of the house, and so he acquires a kind of maturity beyond his years at a very early age.
That death of his father seems so pivotal in shaping who he'll become. It almost seems that after that, he's constantly looking for a father figure, whether it be from the extended family or from the artists he ends up meeting as he's older.
That's true. I think Irving Layton, becomes a kind of major father figure for him early on. He meets Layton in the mid-1950s, and they are inseparable for a long period of time. And Layton is a huge influence, not so much technically as a poet or a writer, but in terms of his his attitude toward life, his philosophy to life, which was to kind of seize it by the throat and experience as much of it as you could. Um, um, Leighton is a different personality entirely to some extent than Leonard. He's much more in your face, much more aggressive, much more assertive. He didn't have the kind of refined manners and courteousness that Leonard displayed on almost every occasion. But so Leighton becomes a kind of father figure for him. But Leonard remains his own man. He always remains his own man. There's another father figure, of course, who appears much later in his life, and that's Sasaki Roshi, Joshu Sasaki Roshi, who's the master of the Zen Center in L.A. and on Mount Baldy that he attends. And Roshi's 20 years older than him, but he's a powerful life force. And if you believe the testimony of many of the people that I've interviewed, Roshi has the ability to see through you in an instant and to cut away all the kind of artifice and layers and surface strategies that one might adopt to hide our inner selves. And Cohen is blown away by that ability, and he's attendant and in service to Sasaki Roshi for 40 years, even though he leaves him for a period and goes to India and studies with a Hindu master as well. So I think your observation is correct. I mean, the loss of the father was pivotal, and maybe, well, obviously you never really replaced that. Cohen was very young. He was 9 years old. The relationship with his father was a bit distant even when Leonard was alive. So I think there was a search there that went on for most of his life.
Well, it ended up complicating things for him, it seems, in the way the book unfolds, in that after his father passes, there's an expectation placed by the Cohens about him joining the family businesses, that he has to really just, he bucks against that. And at the same time, things don't seem terribly well with Masha after that point, especially when she remarries. So life, it gets complicated as he approaches his 20s.
It's true. Well, by his 20s, he knows he wants to be a writer. In fact, he probably knew even earlier. And he kind of recoiled and a bit from the kind of mercantilism and commercial aspirations to material wealth that he saw in his relatives. Not that he didn't want creature comforts around him himself. He didn't want to be poor. And part of his transition from poet novelist to singer-songwriter is precisely because it's the only way he can make a decent living. So he wasn't totally averse to money, but at the same time, he didn't like to be showy about it. And you can see this later in the kind of homes that he set up in Los Angeles and on the plateau in Montreal, which are very spare, bare rooms, no art on the wall, a rug here or there, a minimalist really at heart. But to come back to your point, absolutely, there are strains, but he's got a strength in him. He's strong-willed, and he resists that familial pressure to join one of the family businesses. There were a couple. There was a clothing business. There was a metal parts business. They built pipes and things, and he wanted no part of that. He spent some periods on vacation working in one or other of the businesses, and he was bored to tears.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we should add to that. I mean, the Cohens were responsible for dredging up parts of the St. Lawrence Canal. I mean, that's how foundational they are to Montreal civilization.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that he spent a lot of time in camps in his teenage years, and that was part of his salvation from some of these issues at home with his father and his mother's remarriage, that is. Those camps were pretty formative experiences for him in terms of getting involved in music and presenting himself for the first time.
Absolutely. At 15, he ends up at a summer camp that has a lot of folk music. It's run by a kind of, I think the term might have been fellow traveler, who was very sympathetic to the Soviet Union, kind of an American guy who had communist leanings. And every night they'd have these sing-songs around the campfire based on the People's Songbook, which was this collected works of songs from that came out of the Spanish Civil War or the civil rights movement, nascent at the time in the United States, and he was profoundly influenced by that music. And it's what he basically sang in a very informal context on the island of Hydra when he went there in 1960, and for the few years after that before he turned professional. This was his material. Occasionally he would take a poem of his own and set it to music, and he would sing that, but that was sporadic. Mainly this was his material. So so very much those formative experiences, those Jewish formative experiences were important elements of his young life, for sure.
And also at these camps, we see, I mean, two other developments happening. One is a confidence in his poetry developing, and second is a pattern with women that would continue for the rest of his life, in that they find him very attractive, and he only commits so far.
Yeah, his real commitment was to the work ultimately, and I think definitively. I mean, there are many, many women in his life, some for very short periods of time, some for longer periods of time, and he isn't really able to fully surrender himself to any of them, I think, definitively. But he does have a kind of inner confidence, a quiet confidence about him. It's remarkable how many people I interviewed were struck by that. There's something about him. He became good friends later in his life with the great writer Pico Iyer, who has written a book called, I think it's called The Art of Stillness. And Cohen is almost exemplary, a wonderful example of that, because there was something. Cohen had the ability to remain very still and almost be magnetic at the same time. And women were profoundly drawn to that. There was a kind of vulnerability there. There was a willingness to surrender his entire focus of attention to the woman sitting with him at whatever time it was. He was very gentle. He was very funny. He was very bright. He had all these gifts. So he does, and he had a very healthy libido to boot. So so those are valid observations for sure.
And this seemed to be almost encouraged by Irving Layton and other mentors he had. One of the people you had a lot of access to in the book is Aviva Layton, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about her and your what seemed to be like pretty long encounters with her.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with Aviva, and we had a long sort of supplementary email exchange and afterward, and she's a life force. I mean, she's now, I think, must be 86 years old, but she has the life force of a much younger woman, and she is not afraid to call a spade a spade. She speaks the truth as she sees it, and she doesn't really care about the consequences. And she had a long, tempestuous relationship with Irving Layton. They were never formally married, but they carried on together, on again and off again, a bit like Leonard and Marianne Illen to some extent, for many, many years. And she knew Leonard. There were periods of time when she wasn't much in touch, but she knew him quite well in the 50s and through the 60s and through the 70s, and had some profound insights to offer.
It almost seemed, it reads, and other people in the book seem to confirm this, that Irving, Layton, and Aviva became almost secondary parents to Leonard after his father was gone, and once he began becoming more confident with his poetry, his relationship with his mother really began to fall apart, and it seems like these two really filled that space.
Yeah, to some extent, I think that's true. Irving more as the father than Aviva as the mother. I don't know that she was terribly mothering to him. She had her own emotional needs, and to some extent would lean on Leonard to provide them when she was in difficulty or in jeopardy emotionally with Irving, which was not infrequent. His mother, we've talked about many of her virtues, but at the same time, she was given to manic depression, and at one point in the late 50s was briefly hospitalized in the Allen Institute in Montreal. So that shadow hung over Leonard as well. Here he's without a father. His mother is a bit emotionally unstable to some extent. He's trying to carve his own path, avoiding as best he can the pressure to join the family business. He wants to be a writer, but is that possible? He doesn't want to be a teacher. Not that he doesn't like the teachers that he has huge respect for them, but he doesn't see that as something that will be fulfilling. So he has all these pressures. The Leightons were very close to him in those years, for sure.
I mean, it certainly seems that on top of all this confidence that is really available in spades across the pages of the book, every couple of pages or so, someone hints at his depression. And it seems to be kind of this like undertow that is there throughout the book that is never really fully addressed, but it seems like there's a deep hole there that is part of the dynamic of what makes him such a romantic too.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That depression, plagues him. It must have begun in his adolescence. We don't know precisely when. I think he did go for some counseling early on, or treatment in Montreal at an early age, and it plagues him for most of his adult life, and at times in a very dark way. I mean, he often alluded to it and referred to it, and even talked about it in interviews later on. But I don't know that he actually conveyed the depths of it. Maybe he felt he couldn't. But I mean, I have a couple of stories that appear in later books, where a woman found him, locked in his bathroom for 7 hours, unable to move, basically catatonic. There's another story of another woman who comes over to visit him in Los Angeles, and he's curled up on his balcony outside in a fetal position, unwashed, undressed, unfed, unable to move. And she takes him home and bathes him and feeds him and resuscitates him in a sense. The black dogs of depression really gnawed at him, and when they did, he was incapacitated.
And it really seems that even when he's going through these episodes, he seems to rely on this cornerstone of aristocracy in a way, this decorum, to always be within a certain pose, and that always seems to write him in a certain way.
I think it's all of a piece. I mean, yes, there is certainly civility and decorum and good manners, which came from his good breeding, but it's a way of containing himself. He contained himself in terms of his wardrobe. He contained himself in terms of his affectations. When he entered a room, it would be hello, friends, or goodbye, friends. He wasn't all over the map in terms of his greeting. He wasn't touchy-feely. He didn't embrace people. There was a certain formal distance that he kept from people. You can see it in his handwriting, which becomes sculpted almost. It's very artistic. You can see it in the discipline he brings to bear on his work habits, his writing regimen. You can see it in the types of houses that he chooses to live in and the kind of decor that he establishes in those houses. It's kind of all of a piece. He's kind of stripping down himself to get at the essence, and the essence is the work. And so I see that as a tapestry of, and the civility and the decorum is just a piece of that.
Now, the work in this particular volume, given the years we're talking about, is really poetry and the two novels. Now, that first volume of poetry, Let Us Compare Mythologies, comes out in 1956. Only 500 copies, yet it really transcends that number in terms of reputation. Can you tell us a little bit about the build-up to that volume and how Louis Dudek played such an integral role in bringing it to that level?
So Louis was his professor of literature, of English literature at McGill, and he was a student of his. He very early on recognized Leonard's kind of outsized talent, as I think did Leonard's peers, and promoted him. And then Dudek came up with this idea. Dudek had a kind of entrepreneurial streak for a poet. He was constantly starting new poetry magazines. And then he had this idea to publish books, which, you have to remember in the 1950s and 60s, this is, at a time when television was still in its infancy, and poetry was a kind of one of the bedrocks of Canadian literary culture. I mean, people actually went out and bought poetry books in serious numbers, and and read poetry on the CBC on Saturday nights, and it was a different world to some extent. And Leonard had read Lorca when he was 15 years old, and Lorca had a profound influence on him, and he starts writing shortly after that. So he gravitates into this very fertile milieu of Montreal poets, with Frank Scott and Leighton and Dudek, and he's encouraged because they see his talent, and they invite him to parties where there are much older people around, and he's a bit of a star, but he's self-effacing, and he's gracious, and he's modest about his talent. And so Dudek puts together this McGill Writers series, this poetry series of books, and Leonard is choice number one. The first book that he chooses to publish is Let Us Compare Mythologies in 1956. And yes, 500 copies. If you're fortunate enough to own one of those, it's worth some serious money.
I believe in the book you say it was upwards of $14,000 these days, right?
US.
US. And really, this phase in the late 50s, from Let Us Compare Mythologies through The Spice Box of Earth, this is really when early Cohen seems to have it best. He's on the ascent, and Montreal is really gathering around him.
Absolutely. Montreal and the women are gathering around him when in 1964, his publisher, Jack McClellan at McClellan and Stewart, and again, you probably couldn't do this today. McClellan approaches the National Film Board, and he's got 4 books of poetry coming out, including books by Cohen and by Leighton and 2 others, and he persuades them to do a film. He's going to take these poets on the road across Canada. Imagine that in 1964. He's going to take them on the road, and the National Film Board is going to make a documentary film about 4 poets. That would not happen today, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, so lo and behold, the film board agrees. The poets embark. I think it actually happens in 1965, and or the fall of '64. I can't remember. And so they go to Toronto, they go to Vancouver, they go to Edmonton, they go to Winnipeg, and then they come back to cut the film. And it turns out that 2 of the poets don't have a lot of life, and cinematically they're a bit dull. Irving Leighton is well known and arguably overexposed in terms of the culture. And Leonard is this star. He's just a shining star. He's got this fantastic intelligence, a biting wit. And they decide to re-edit the film and reshoot it in order to focus exclusively on Leonard Cohen. And so the film's called Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen. You can watch it on YouTube. It's an extraordinary piece of work. Don Britton and Don Owen, 2 of the finest documentary filmmakers in the country at the time, were co-directors of that film. So yes, so this is the peak of his career. He goes from the Spice Box of Earth to Flowers for Hitler in 1964 to Parasites of Heaven in 1966, and that's really the moment when I think, influenced by what he was seeing in the American folk music scene, and particularly by Bob Dylan, a guy who I'm sure in Leonard's judgment was a great poet, but couldn't sing any better than Leonard could, but was making a huge success of himself. I think that's the moment when Leonard said, I can do that, and I can perhaps make a decent living at it, which I can't do writing novels and writing poetry books.
Mm-hmm. And it really seems in the book that, I mean, there's a convergence of several elements that lead to that moment that aren't all pure ambition. There's a lot of frustration leading into that, too. The novels didn't do what he wanted to do. Hydra was becoming a bit of a tourist trap, and there was a lot of drug use going on in his writing that was beginning to deepen this well of depression and womanizing that was also happening underneath all of this.
Well, remember, this is the 1960s. You have a sexual revolution with the introduction of the pill. You have a political revolution that's going on in Quebec. You have a music revolution that begins with the British invasion. You have a drug revolution that begins, I don't know if it begins with LSD, but LSD is a formative part of it. And Leonard is into all of these things in a big way. And he uses in the mid 1960s, he uses LSD every week. He wants to experiment. He's testing the Irving Layton hypothesis. Let's drink life to the lees, as Tennyson said, and see where this leads. And I want to experience this. What impact will this have on my life, on my writing? So he's very much a part of that culture. And the depression is there. I think to some extent, the drug use and the womanizing and later the religious explorations are attempts to kind of to keep depression at bay. They are diversions that he hopes will keep these black dogs away. And to some extent they do, and to some extent they don't.
A lot of this period centers around Marianne Eland, who you mentioned before, but really a very important figure in both the creative life and the personal life of Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, Marianne is a Norwegian beauty. When Leonard meets her in the spring of 1960 on Idre, she is just recently separated from her husband, who was a very successful at the time Norwegian novelist. She has a young child who's not more than a year old. And she very quickly is introduced into Leonard's world, and very soon thereafter they are essentially living together on the island of Idre. And that relationship spans on and off through most of the 1960s. It ends towards 1968, 69. She becomes a kind of muse to him. I don't want to overstate it, but there is a muse-like quality to her. She certainly encouraged him and provided the context and the order and discipline in the family home that enabled him to continue writing. But there were long stretches when they were apart. Leonard came back to Canada to make some dollars as a freelance writer. She would go back to Norway with the son to spend some time with her own immediate family. And there were strains in that relationship because Leonard was unable to be faithful to Marianne, and Marianne in turn was unable to be faithful to Leonard. So that provoked some serious strains and ultimately led to the breakup. But she remains in his life really till the end. I don't think it clearly it was not as strong in the years thereafter, but she was an important figure at a very important time for him.
In 1967, after the critical failure of the first two novels, which have gone on to become part of the canon at this point, but in the 60s, it's important to note that they were not well received initially, or not as well as he wanted them to be received.
Yeah, I would say mixed. I mean, I think Favorite Game attracted some good notices. Beautiful Losers was all over the map. Robert Fulford, the great Canadian critic, I think called it, the worst novel he'd ever read, but also the most interesting, or words to that effect, in the Toronto Star at the time. It sold reasonably well. His poetry sold reasonably well, but he was struggling financially. He was still having to loan money from his uncles occasionally, or from his inheritance. So that wasn't satisfying to him. He didn't want money to acquire cars and jewelry and fine carpets. He wanted money to be able to travel and be on the move and experience life.
And so by 1967, we see him moving to the US, and we finish off the decade with two classic albums, Songs of Leonard Cohen and Songs from a Room. This is really when the Leonard Cohen we all know, instantly recognize today, emerges. Can you tell us a little bit about that move? And I believe the song Suzanne, as it was covered by Judy Collins, is really what broke him.
Yeah, Judy Collins is a critical, comes along at a very critical time. He had a manager in Canada, in the United States, Mary Martin, who had worked in New York and had set up her own agency. And she was a friend of Judy Collins, and she would see her socially, and she'd say, I've got this young man. He's in his early 30s. He writes wonderful poetry, and he's written some songs. And would you be willing to hear some of these songs? And she said, sure. So at some point early in 1966, Leonard is in New York, and he meets Judy, and he plays her the songs. And as it happens, she's in the middle of putting together her next album, and is short a song or two. and she hears Suzanne and is blown away. He plays her 3 songs, I think: the Suzanne, the Master Song, and the Stranger Song. I told you when I came, I was a stranger. I think that line could be a calling card for Leonard Cohen. But anyway, so she loves these songs, and she takes them to her producer, and he loves these songs. She puts it on her next album, and Judy Collins popularizes Suzanne in a way that, because she was touring around the United States, and it becomes an instant hit. Nobody knows that Leonard Cohen wrote it. They don't know who Leonard Cohen is, but it hardly matters. And then Judy starts to appear at, the Newport. She sits on the board of the Newport Folk Festival, and she ensures that Leonard gets a gig there, and she brings him before a benefit concert at what became the Fillmore East in New York, and forces him on stage, and suddenly Leonard Cohen becomes known in the United States. Although the songs ultimately, through that period, those first 2 albums and into the early 70s, ultimately have far more resonance in Europe, where he's kind of treated as a poet chansonnier. He's in the tradition of the great French chansonniers.
Right, they have a rubric for that there. He loses the rights to Suzanne.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, the story's a bit murky, but his manager, Mary Martin, arranges for him to meet a young guy who she hopes will help arrange the music, because really what Leonard had were these kind of not very sophisticated melodic lines. They were not, the lyrics were done, the music was there, but they needed embellishments, and so she introduces him to an arranger, and the arranger has Leonard sign some papers, and either he's not thinking straightly, or just by virtue of his he doesn't really, he doesn't know what he's signing. He essentially signs away the rights to those 3 songs. He reacquires them in the mid 1980s, but for all those years he doesn't get the royalties to the 3 of his most famous songs. So he was a little miffed by all of that. So that is that period. Those 2 albums kind of put him on the map as a musical star.
Well, throughout this conversation, we've been seeing some questions pop up, and we've got a number of them here. Perhaps we can go to the audience and see what people have been thinking while you've been sharing this wonderful and generous history of Leonard Cohen. So let's see if I can get this open here. Question number 1. What is your opinion of Hallelujah, a new biography by Tim Footman?
To be honest, I haven't read it. I haven't read everything. There are at least 5 or 6 biographies of Leonard Cohen just in the English language. There's one in French that's very good. There's one in Dutch that's very good. They're both more interpretive biographies, that is to say, somewhat academic, but very well written and very insightful. I haven't read the Footman, to be honest, so I can't really comment.
I mean, it begs the question, with someone who's so well documented as this, how much research do you go do in other people's books before going to the sources yourself?
Well, I certainly I've read Sylvie's cover to cover a couple of times. Ira Nadell, who teaches English literature at University of British Columbia, wrote a very good book called Various Positions. I think there were 2 versions of it. One came out sort of 96, 97, and the other one's not long after that. And it's a very good book. Ira kind of tilts to the literary side of Leonard's life. Sylvie, being a music journalist, tilts more to the musical side, but they're both excellent books. I mean, part of my challenge, of course, was to add new material. I mean, there are enough biographies of the principal storylines of Leonard Cohen's life. But it was my instinct as a journalist that there was more to be had, that there were people out there with whom he had interacted, either in literature or in music or in Zen or in Judaism or in the world of romance in which he lived, these various compartmentalized worlds, and that there was more to be had. And so that was the challenge. But, obviously, as I said earlier, you can't ignore these principal storylines. You can't write a biography of Leonard Cohen and leave out Judy Collins, even though that story has been told half a dozen times or more.
And for my money, really, the oral history approach to this book is bringing out all the conflict that are underlying a lot of these central storylines. This is what really humanizes Leonard Cohen for the 21st century, because, right, you know, we have these conversations now, but what kind of people we're going to carry forward in the culture. I wonder, with someone with Leonard Cohen's past, do you worry about that? Is the culture seems to love him so much, but is he someone we're going to carry forward with, and if so, for what reasons?
Yeah, I think he's going to be with us a long time. In fact, you know, when I meet people who are reluctant to be interviewed, and there are people who just want to preserve their Leonard Cohen memories in some private archive without ever telling their stories. And I think I say to them, I think I understand your position, but I think that does a disservice to history, because you know, I don't want to equate Leonard Cohen to William Shakespeare. I think that would be foolish. I don't even want to equate him to the German writer Goethe or to Chekhov. I mean, but I do think his music and his writing will last a long time. I do think it will speak to generations for a very long time. And I do think people will be curious to try to connect the dots between the life he actually lived quotidianly on a day-to-day basis and the work, you know, because in the same way that his first novel, A Favorite Game, is largely autobiographical, in the same way that many of his poems come directly out of lived experiences, in the same way that some of his music, the lyrics for certain songs are about specific individuals, about specific events that actually occurred. I'm trying to, I saw it as my challenge to say, who is he writing about here? Which woman is he writing about? When did that woman tie him to the kitchen chair, which actually happened, by the way, which comes from the song Hallelujah, as you probably know. So I think he'll be with us for a very long time. And so my argument to people who have been reluctant to be interviewed is, I hear you, and I understand that these are very private sentiments and very private memories. But if you take the long view, that Leonard's going to be with us a long time, people are going to want to know. They're going to be curious about him. You know, we have 12 facts about Shakespeare that we can definitively say this happened to him. The rest is all, there's 150 books about Shakespeare. They're virtually all speculative. You know, they say, it must have been the case that William Shakespeare did this, or we can assume that. Well, with Leonard Cohen, we don't have to use that kind of, you know, conditional language. We can actually say, no, his friend Henry Zemel said this. You know, he brought home a suit of clothes from Greece to give to Henry Zemel in 1966. And Henry Zemel, as he would say now, he says, and I was foolish enough to reject it. You know, these are interesting stories about his generosity or his wit or his acerbity or whatever it is. And so, you know, he's an important cultural figure. He's going to be with us a long time. And so that's my answer.
And speaking of posterity, a good question just popped up in the sidebar here by David Balkin. Given Bob Dylan recently receiving the Nobel Literature Prize, and this was a big debate for most people a couple of years back, should Leonard Cohen have received such an honor with a greater literary past?
You know, it's a really good question, and it's one I've posed to a lot of people that I've interviewed, because I actually have a little section in the last book that deals with that award. Leonard, as you probably know, was very generous. You know, he said giving Dylan the Nobel Prize for Literature is like pinning a medal on Mount Everest. Very, very generous. I have no doubt that Leonard would have loved to have been named as a co-recipient. You know, it kind of puzzles me in a way that the Nobel Committee didn't do that, because they do it for science and medicine. They do it for chemistry. They do it for physics. There's all kinds of joint prizes. Why choose Dylan over Cohen? You know, I interviewed Malcolm Merrim, who was a Canadian folk singer and then a wonderful journalist in Canada, and she knew Leonard quite well, and she made the observation that giving Dylan the Nobel was the right decision because Dylan is the voice of his generation, and that's what the Nobel Committee had recognized. Leonard Cohen is the voice for all generations. And there is a level at which I think that very astute observation is valid, which is to say that Leonard's work is kind of at a distance. I mean, you can make exceptions because, the album, The Future, is very much more based on current events. But in general, he's taking the view from 35,000 feet and kind of looking at humanity and at human relationships in a broader context. It's not of the moment. And so I think, maybe he was slighted to some extent, but I have a whole range of opinions. Some people insist the Nobel Committee made the wrong decision. Some believe they made the absolutely right decision. And then there's some who are on the fence.
This somewhat dovetails into our next question. There is someone on the chat who is asking for how long Leonard Cohen was attracted to Jesus and Christianity. And I think we'll make the distinction between Judaism and Catholicism here, because he did have a very particular attraction to Catholicism, namely with one of the women he dated, Poulain, who you mentioned you speak to in the book, if that's right. And he was quite fascinated by the iconography and everything that comes with that.
Yeah, and he spent, as you probably know, spent some time, because he had a nanny when he was a young boy. He had an Irish Catholic nanny who used to take him to church. He was fascinated by the ceremony and the ritual, the pageantry of Catholicism that he saw unfold before him on Christmas Eve, midnight mass or whatever. He later, as he came of age, he was drawn to the intellectual elements of Christianity. He read deeply in the subject. He was very well versed in the New Testament. To some extent, he used his knowledge in crafting his lyrics and putting them in his poetry and song. He was never a Christian. He was never ever going to be a Christian, but he did regard Jesus as a perhaps arguably the most important man who ever lived. He saw him. He didn't see him as a Christian. He saw him as a Jewish rabbi who gave birth to a new religion that comes to life essentially after the crucifixion, decades after the crucifixion, or in the years after the crucifixion. So he saw him. I think he thought the Sermon on the Mount was the best thing ever written. One of the best poems ever written. So he had deep respect for Christianity, but it was intellectual respect.
He distinguishes between priests and prophets in the books, right? This is a very controversial talk he gave in front at the Jewish Public Library, I believe.
Yeah, he does. In December 1963, he gives a speech at the Jewish Public Library, and then again in June 1964, he gives two speeches, and he does distinguish between priests and prophets, he looks at another great Jewish poet in Montreal, and says that he's really emblematic of the priest. He's to some extent in service to the Jewish community. He's unable to be distant from it. He's to some extent unable to criticize it. And Leonard carves out for himself very distinctly and very deliberately, I'm not going to be that priest. I want to be able to stand at a distance from that community, because there are aspects of its behavior that I don't approve. He didn't believe in building these large, lavish, ornate temples to, the synagogues of Montreal. There were aspects of Jewish Montreal, certainly in the 1960s, that he kind of recoiled from, and he wanted to be a prophet. There are times when he said, half jokingly in social situations, maybe I am the Messiah. Although Irving Layton had said the same thing about himself.
It seems so jokingly once you get deeper into the book. There is this kind of messianic complex that's built up amongst those poets.
There is, and listen, I think this is not what the book attempts to do, but I think scholars, may one day want to trace that line, that messianic line, through his work, because it's there, and it's there right to the end. The last album that he recorded, You Want It Darker, not the one that his son put together, Adam put together so well after his death. but You Want It Darker is, if it's anything, it's messianic to me. And so yeah, so he was very conscious of that, and that begins right very early on in the mid-60s.
I mean, how conscious is he of his own myth making? Certainly, I mean, when we speak of that messianic line going into his later years, it's arguably what makes him such a massive figure so late in his life, where other artists usually falter or just disappear. He grows into something beyond human almost in the way he carries himself.
He does, and I think if you want to measure success, well, Dylan is still with us. Mick Jagger's still with us. Paul Simon is still with us to some extent. There are lots of artists who have spanned the generations, but certainly one of the measures of a great artist is longevity, and Leonard certainly fills that bill. Come back to your question again. What was it?
Oh, it was how conscious he was about his myth making. But I feel like you've already addressed that. There's a question I wanted to get to before we run out of time here from one of the audience members who asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Leonard Cohen over the course of all this research?
Well, there's so many, really. I mean, sometimes it came down to little ways that he behaved, but he was profoundly generous. When he made money, his instinct was, he had a generous spirit. He had a generous spirit meeting anybody on the street. He was generous in quiet ways, without ever advertising it to people who needed money. He paid for holidays for friends who were in need, or medical operations when the children of his friends needed it, or he didn't hang on to his money. He was very, very generous. I don't know if it's surprising, but I am struck as I go through these interviews by the degree of his dedication to craftsmanship and what was on the page in front of him, and the daily discipline required to sit down with pen and paper and write, and write 80 verses of Hallelujah before you came up with the 4 or 5 that you wanted to record, or the 5 years that it took him to write If It Be Thy Will, If It Be Your Will. He never, only on one occasion, I think the song Sisters of Mercy that he wrote in Montreal, December 1966, he wrote it in a night, basically. That's rare. Almost all of his work was a labor of painstaking labor over years, and he kept trying to refine it. And if you look at the lyrics of some of the later songs, particularly You Want It Darker, and some of the earlier albums as well, they have a kind of Samuel Beckett quality. That is to say, they're almost monosyllabic. If there's a 3-syllable word in those lyrics, it's really rare, and most of them are 1 syllable. He's stripping everything down to its bare essence. So that dedication to craft, I don't know if I would call it surprising, but it's striking.
I mean, to finish off with a last question, if we can take a moment to geek out here, do you have a personal favorite in terms of a song or a book of his that you keep returning to?
In terms of the poetry, I think The Spice Box of Earth is my favorite. Although the Book of Mercy is kind of like a series of hymns that is very powerful, and not much paid attention to, but it has a religious quality that I like. In terms of the song, there's too many. It's too many.
Dimitri, Michael, thank you so very much. This was an absolutely thrilling conversation. I can't thank you enough for the wealth of information that you both have brought to this dialogue. I ask everyone watching and tuned in to please share your energy with Dimitri and Michael. What an absolutely wonderful evening that we had together. Thanks to everyone that tuned in. If you haven't already, make sure to run out and get this book. You can actually click the button right at the bottom of your screen that says click here to buy Leonard Cohen, The Untold Stories, the first in a trilogy. I'm very excited for the other 2 volumes coming out. And of course, remember to follow us, TPL Culture. Click the follow button above to make sure you catch all of this wonderful programming that we've been putting out. Once again, gentlemen, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dimitri. Wonderful question.
Thank you, Michael. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for the call.